Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Psychology of Business podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Brandon Griffin, and we have a special treat for you today. Joining me in my virtual studio is Inara Scott. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thank you.
So Inara Scott is the author and editor of a new volume called Sustainable Capitalism, Essential Work for the Anthropocene. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. But before we dig into that, before we dig into her new work, let's talk about who you are and let's talk about your background.
Okay. So I like to say that I'm what happens when you don't plan ahead and when you have a short attention span. So I've had a lot of different careers in my life. I started out actually getting my master's degree in outdoor education and recreation. Very much loved the process of experiential education and experiential learning. I was an outdoor education guide and trip leader. And then I was thinking about pursuing a PhD in that area, but a very wise person actually convinced me that I probably was better suited to law. So I went to law school and studied environmental law and found that I did some work with what was then traditional environmental law, which did not include energy law. So interestingly, at the time, we didn't really think about the energy when we thought about the environment. We thought about the forests and the water and the air, but we didn't really think about the impact of energy as much as we do now. So I was working in more traditional environmental law circles and found I really didn't like the black and white approach to environmental law that was very much good guys and bad guys, and everybody sort of just went into any kind of negotiation assuming it would be a terrible fight, and that typically the environmentalists would lose, and they were the good guys and they were bad guys, and that very quickly became clear that was not going to be a good path for me. My general approach to the world and life is everybody has a piece of the truth, and I'm really interested in hearing what all of those different pieces are. And I found that actually in the practice of energy law, that was a much more likely perspective to be successful. So we would have really large negotiations with small customers and big customers and regulated utilities and environmental groups and industrial groups and consumer advocates. And we'd have these huge negotiations with lots and lots of different parties, and everybody was just sort of trying to get things done. And I found that was a really good place for me. So I was an energy lawyer. I worked in regulated industries. Worked for a couple of different utility companies before I found my way into academia. So I was brought into Oregon State University in 2012 to teach about environmental and energy law in our MBA track, and generally started my research and publishing in that area. So my early works are really around energy usage and regulation. And then over time, I began to pivot more towards just sustainable business in general. So my research became much broader. And then probably about 4 or 5 years ago, I just really developed this interest as I was teaching in sustainable business in capitalism and what that meant both to my students and to society and what I was hearing and seeing about it.
Mm-hmm. So now you're the Senior Associate Dean at the College of Business in Oregon State University. Is that correct?
That's right.
Wonderful. So one thing I really like that you said you believe every person has a little bit of the truth. So I teach organizational behavior, management, and leadership. And one thing that I try to stress with my students is no one believes that they're wrong. No one believes that the perspective they hold is incorrect, because there's a reason why people believe X, Y, and Z. And if someone has a different upbringing or a different set of facts or different priorities, they're going to believe X, Y, and Z. And it doesn't necessarily mean that they're right or wrong. It's just from their perspective, they believe they're right. So I think, especially in the fight that you've been studying, that you were working in, I think that's very true.
Yeah. And I think, so one of the things that I tend to do as well is when I'm really diametrically opposed to somebody and their perspective and beliefs, I just ask myself, why would they think this is the best thing for their family and their children and their grandchildren or others, that they care really deeply about? And you can usually come up with a reason why they believe that's the best for the people that they care about. And I think if you come into it with that perspective, it's really hard to think of people as enemies. You just think I think the other important thing is we don't all believe or want the same things. I think that's one of those sort of next step people say is, oh, we just all want the same thing. We actually don't, right? All necessarily believe or want the same thing. And I think that's really important to be okay with that and to understand that that's the case, because sometimes I think we end up just assuming that we, somewhere at the heart of it all want the same thing. And then we think the other person's, misguided or, or worse because they don't want to get there the way that we do. When in fact, we said, oh, they actually aren't trying to get to the same place that we're trying to get to. And that's what's actually going on here. Then I think you have a really different set of questions that you're asking. So those are all things I think that underlie and are a foundation for the way that I approach these conversations.
And I think differences in a marketing plan are going to be a lot less friction than something that you truly believe in. So when dealing with sustainability and capitalism and business and the environment, I think that's something people are going to have a lot more disagreement on, whether you're on whichever side you're on. So do you want to dig in a little bit more about your book? So it's called Sustainable Capitalism, Essential Work for the Anthropocene. So what is this book? Why did you want to write this book? And do you just want to introduce us to this topic?
Absolutely. So I was teaching a sustainable business course, and I had been teaching it probably for close to, 6 or 7 years. And what I was seeing increasingly was that students would come into class either believing capitalism was evil and business was evil. And this was even some of the business students. So they would come in thinking business is bad. And either I'm engaging in business because I sort of have to just to support a family or to be financially viable, but it's still bad. Or they would come in and say, business is just 100% good and it's going to save the world. And both of those, and I would say that probably predominantly more of the former, like we are seeing, and the surveys suggest, particularly younger people are very disillusioned with this notion of what capitalism is. And they really have this sense that business is not good. It doesn't serve society. It doesn't exist to serve society. And I was hearing that from my students, and then we would talk about ways that corporations and businesses could do really good, important things and be really beneficial to society. And they would sort of furrow their brow and be like, well, is that okay though? Is it okay for me to engage in business if I'm not trying to maximize profits? So we would get to this profit maximization thing where they would feel like it was somehow unethical not to maximize profits, or it was unethical for the business to be concerned with society. And so I said, we got a lot of unpacking to do if this is where we have gotten to. Because if you have studied the role of business in society, this is a pretty recent development, that it was not an assumption in 1940 that business was intended to maximize profit. And that was actually a place that we got to over time. Particularly thanks to neoliberalism and Chicago School of Economics and Milton Friedman, folks that will be familiar to many people listening to the podcast. So I was hearing all of that, and I was engaged in regulation and climate work, and I thought we have to dig into this a little bit, because we are locked into some kind of an economic system here. And I guess I should say I'm a realist at heart, so I want to know what we can do positively. I don't want to throw up my hands and say all is lost. And so I wanted to dig into when people say capitalism is bad, or when they say business should or shouldn't maximize wealth, like where do those ideas come from and what do they really mean? And the more engaged I got in this, I started seeing capitalism as this incredibly complicated subject that spanned, economics, history, political science, law, really the gamut of approaches. And everybody seemed to have a different definition of capitalism, and they seemed to have a different understanding of what it did. So that was really what prompted me to write the book, because I wanted to understand it for myself. I wanted to be able to share with my students a sense of hope and a sense that we are not locked into a completely negative trajectory. And I wanted to see what that would look like. So So that was really the sort of the idea, the germinating idea behind the book.
And if we have to take the perspective that capitalism is bad, or if people have that frame in mind that it's bad, why is that? Because if I think of capitalism in more of a negative light, it's kind of, there are these smokestacks that are, spewing out stuff. There are millions of cars
Right.
on the road. It's fast fashion. It's the rich are getting richer. There are inequalities. Is that why people can have this perspective that capitalism is bad, or it's reached a point where it's bad?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of reasons why people have reached this perspective, and I think part of it is that it is really hard for people to deal in nuance, and it is much easier to think about big black and white, sort of easy answers to things, and it is much more convenient to think about a big bad, like a big villain that is driving bad stuff, rather than to think, really into the nuances of how did that develop. So I think part of it is just ease, like it's a convenient scapegoat. I think part of it is very rationally the system of American capitalism, that this particular brand of capitalism that we have developed in the United States, particularly in the last 50 years or so, and have exported across the world, is not good for the earth, is not particularly good for workers. It is based in large part on some pretty dark historical foundations, including slavery and racism. So I don't think it's not unfounded to think about American capitalism as having a lot of really bad outcomes and being based on some really nasty stuff. So that piece of it is totally rational. The piece of it that I really wanted to dig into is like, well, when I look around the globe, there are a lot of different types of capitalism that don't look exactly like US style capitalism. So, for example, I wrote a paper with a colleague of mine who's also one of the authors in the book, and we were contrasting American capitalism to European capitalism, and it's very different, right? It has a very different flavor to it, which made me say then, well, then what is capitalism? If it can look so different in Europe, if it can look so different in Germany versus the UK versus France versus the US, then when we say capitalism, what do we even mean? I don't even think we even know what that means most of the time. So I think those are probably the places I would look at is, there's some pretty dark stuff, I think, in American capitalism, and that's totally valid. And it reflects a series of policy choices and the unique foundation of capitalism that emerged in the United States in particular. And so all of those things, I think, make it easy to blame capitalism with a capital C, right, for a lot of stuff that we could actually trace back to other actors and other characteristics.
Mm-hmm. And what's the flip argument? Obviously we're here, we're on the internet, we're on computers, our standard of living has increased, but what's the flip argument for why capitalism is good? Because, there is the famous quote by Milton Friedman, the only social responsibility that an organization has is to maximize profits or to maximize, shareholder value. So what's the flip side of that? So if someone comes in with the perspective that capitalism is good, what is that argument?
Yeah. And I want to actually pull apart Milton Friedman, put him off on the shelf, because one of the most interesting things that I discovered in my research was how terrified Milton Friedman was of communism, and how much of what he was talking about was really a product of early Cold War. And this fear that if the United States embraced social activities of business, that we were actually going to become a communist nation. So I want to put him aside for a second, because he and the other neoliberals, they created a particular version of capitalism. But I would say, so what are the good things about capitalism? There's a lot of research that suggests that capitalism has lifted millions and millions of people out of poverty. That capitalism, again, undefined, right? We don't really know what that word means, but we have had capitalist type economies in place during the same period of time in which people have been lifted out of poverty. We have these enormous technological innovations. Some people would point to COVID-19 vaccine and say, look, we would not have gotten out of the COVID-19 pandemic were it not for structures that support innovation and have profit associated with them, right? People would, I think, many people would make that argument. So I think that there is the argument that capitalism, and let me say here, there is an argument that a structure that supports people to individually profit from their particular work in a way that is different from other people in the same society. Like if I can put all those words together and call that capitalism, then I think it's pretty straightforward to see how that could support innovation, right? Like if we create a structure that if you work harder, if you are creative, if you are able to create something new and different that people haven't seen before, and you will uniquely be profited from that, that's going to encourage you to do that kind of activity. Right? That seems pretty straightforward. So if we call that capitalism, then we can say, yeah, there's a lot of good things that structure could do and support.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for that definition. So the subtitle for your book is Essential Work for the Anthropocene. We talked about this a little bit before we started the interview.
Yeah.
I had to look that up. I didn't know what that definition was. But from my brief research, it just seems like Industrial Revolution came on, but for the thousands, tens of thousands, millions of years that humans have been on the earth, we have not had a huge impact on the environment. We have not had a huge impact, but with the Industrial Revolution, it just seems like things switched. So that's where we go from being kind of a part of the land to actively changing the land and creating products and chemicals and things that are just going to be forever, on the planet. So that's kind of my idea of the Anthropocene. So basically how humanity has impacted the economy in the world since the Industrial Revolution. Could you give me a better definition of what that is?
Yes, with the caveat that I'm not a geologist. So the Anthropocene was a term that was created to mark a period of history in which the impact of humans on the globe and on the earth was recognizable from the geologic record. So if you were a geologist in 10,000 years and you look back at the soil and the ice cores and the rocks, right, that were laid down in this period, you would be able to see an increase in, let's say, carbon dioxide emissions, an increase in soot, an increase, right, in other chemicals in the geologic layers. So it really is sort of a geologic term that was intended to be like, we could actually identify when we switched over to humans having this significant impact on the earth. More generally, I would say I find the term useful and appealing because it says we humans are having an enormous impact on the earth. And if the earth is going to be sustainable for our societies, we have an obligation, a responsibility, and there is no way to avoid us taking some steps to make it more sustainable. It will not become more sustainable on its own, on the path that we're on.
And what is the main thesis of your book? Obviously, sustainable capitalism with this new era that humans are impacting the world, the geologic record. But what's the main thesis of your book? Is it introducing this nuanced perspective and drawing from the different different countries' capitalism? What's the main thesis of your book?
The main idea of the book is that we have much more agency over the future and what our impact is going to be on the world than we give ourselves credit for. And then we can have a much more positive impact than we think we can, including within a capitalist framework. So what I really want people to take away from this book is this idea that capitalism is not a big bad that lives outside of the world and is doing things to us. We are creating a structure, and our societies are operated under a structure. It's economic, it's political, right? It's sociological. It is all of those things together, and that is driving our future. And so if we want a more sustainable future, it is available to us. We can do that. We have that power, even within capitalism. And that is really what I want people to take away is I hear from my students and I hear in the popular media a lot this sort of chain of thinking. A, capitalism is evil and destroying the world. B, we can't get rid of capitalism. And therefore, C, we're screwed, right? There is no positive future for us. And that makes sense. If you believe A and B, then where's the hope, right? And so I think I want to challenge both of the A and the B. I want to challenge this idea that capitalism by itself is a bad thing. I don't believe that's true. And I want to challenge this idea that we are stuck with this bad thing as it currently exists. And so if we can get rid of both of those assumptions, then I think we can see there's much more that we can do to make this planet healthier and to make our societies healthier.
And I think that if you look at the data, just at what we consume, if we constantly use plastic water bottles, if we are buying products that come from people who are being, overworked and underpaid in awful conditions, I think there are obviously bad parts of capitalism, things that can be fixed. So what steps can we take? I'm a business professor. I am teaching future business leaders, but what are some things we can do to make it not seem, like if we continue on the trajectory that we're going, the world's gonna, implode. What actually can we do? So what is that hope that you're talking about?
So here's the first concept that I want people to take away, which is there is no such thing as a free market. So I think part of what people think is that capitalism requires quote unquote free markets. And as a lawyer, right, and other folks kind of looking at how economies actually function, there is absolutely no such thing as a free market. The only way that markets function is through law and regulation. So you think about all of the laws that have to exist. Private property, it's one of these core fundamental pieces of capitalism. Why does private property exist? It's a legal right. It's a bundle of rights. I get to keep the thing. I get to keep other people from taking the thing. I get to sell the thing. I get to buy other things, right? There's all of these implied rights associated with property. In law, we call them a bundle of rights. They're all legal. They're all regulatory. Somebody came up with those. They did not come down from tablets, right? Like somebody actually created this legal structure to support this idea of private property. Contracts. The fact that you can have somebody agree to work for you and do something for you, and then you can compensate them from your capital, that's a legal concept, right? When we actually look at how markets function, they are not free in the sense that people just go into some marketplace somewhere and then money is exchanging hands and then everything is great because it's free. Markets function because there is support for all of these concepts. And if we think about all of the ways that markets are regulated now, we think about safety regulations, we think about child labor protections, we think about anti-slavery laws, we think about the laws that protect workers, we think about even things like the way that corporations are organized or shareholder votes or, getting, not to mention all of the financial regulations, the way that banks are supported by government. All of these are pieces of a system. So there is no free market. There is a market that is a series of regulatory choices that governments have made. Right? And we have this balance that we create between the amount of regulation and the amount of choice within the system that we allow people to have. So we allow people certain choices, like you can choose to go out and buy a shirt from the store, but you cannot choose to go out and buy a kidney because we've made it illegal to trade in organs. Right? So we've also said that you can have an arrangement where somebody loans you money and then you have to pay them back with interest. We have a legal structure that supports that. Right? We have a legal structure that says you can't sell cocaine. So all of those are choices. All of those are regulatory choices. So how do we become more sustainable? We just change the levers of our choices. We are making choices all the time about what we are agreeing to do and not to do. Right? So when we think about some of the early history of environmental regulation, think about the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, they were all responses to people seeing what happens when a whole lot of people impact the environment in such a way that it creates a negative outcome. So if I have a factory and I pump an endless amount of, so think about England, when there was an enormous amount of coal being used to heat homes, there were a couple of these huge smog incidents, and I can't remember the name offhand of the one of them, but when there would be a weather inversion that would like trap all these horrible chemicals right close to into the London, lots and lots of people died. So right, reasonably people said, hey, we don't want to have all these people dying. Let's restrict the amount of coal, soot, and pollution that you can put in the environment. These are really straightforward ABCs, right? Like, lots of people putting stuff into the environment creates toxic smog, people die, government says, and people say, hey, we want to have some limits on the amount of toxic soot because we don't want to die. Okay, so that really clear trajectory is always a balance. How much do you restrict it? So the question is not, should we ever do regulations, and should we ever regulate pollution? Should we regulate what people put in our water supply? Of course we should. Do we want somebody dumping arsenic into our reservoirs? I don't think there's any sane person that would say, why, yes, let's just let corporations dump whatever arsenic they want into our water supply. Everyone would say no. And so the question, again, it's just a balance, right? We're saying, what is going to keep people safe in a way that we as a society decide we want to keep them safe? And balance that with what's the economic impact of that regulation, and what do we think is the economic impact that we want to have. So it's always a balance. So if you think about it that way, right, every time we make regulations, we are engaging in a balancing act between what's the societal outcome that we want to have and what's the economic impact going to be. Okay? So they're not easy answers, but the nature of the question, I think, is really straightforward. And that, if I could get that into people's head, I would consider that a win. That they're always engaging in these balancing acts. And there is no simple answer to like, oh, just stop regulating. That's not an answer, So that is what I want students in my classes. I want people reading this book. I want, people who are, kind of out there thinking about what we want the world to look like, to think about it that way. What are the choices that we want to make? What's the balance that we want to strike? And what can that look like?
Mm-hmm. So I'm not an economist, but I do have friends who are free market economists. So, if they watch this or whatever, they're going to have some words for that. And I think their initial things like, there are decisions that people are going to make that should be done in the free market rather than introduced by regulation. So do you believe that in the book, so to make capitalism more sustainable, are these things that need to be put into regulations? So just like the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, are these things that need to be implemented, through government oversight, through government regulation?
So the book provides a lot of different potential things that could be done. And it doesn't prescribe a series. It's not a playbook. Okay. Yeah. It's not, here's the 5 things that we have to do to become more sustainable. It is a number of authors, including myself, are sort of talking about what types of things can we do, including, some related to labor, some related to the environment, some related to innovation, technology, intellectual property. So I want to just say that, right? So this isn't a series of like, you must do X, Y, or Z. You have to implement, a particular set of legislative fixes. There are books that do that. This is not one of them. So there isn't going to be a litmus test, right? There's not going to be a thing to say, do regulate this, don't regulate this. Again, it's going to be us deciding what the outcome is that we want. And I can't prescribe that for the entire society. I can't tell us what the outcome is. So if we are deeply troubled by the number of Americans living without a house, right? So we have a huge houselessness problem here in Oregon. And some people deeply believe that there is a human right to a safe place to live, a roof over somebody's head. And other people don't believe that. They just don't, right? So this goes back to this notion that not everybody believes in the same thing. If society says this is a human right and we want to make sure that we preserve that for everybody, we want to make sure that everybody in our community has access to a home, we're going to make a series of regulatory and policy choices to support that. If we don't believe that, we're going to make a different series of regulatory and policy choices. So that's kind of a non-answer to your question, but I think that's really is the most important question: is what is the social outcome that we want? So a couple of them I think that are pretty straightforward is we want to have enough resources to be able to meet the needs of the current generation and the future generations. Right? That's kind of the sustainable development. That's what that original definition was. Sustainable development is just development that creates sufficient resources to meet the needs of current and future generations. We are exceeding planetary boundaries on all sorts of resources: clean air, soil, water, right? So those seem like pretty straightforward societal choices to me. And then we have to figure out what is the legal structure and the regulatory choices that would help us get to that. And it's not going to be just, you can't do X. It's also going to be, how do we incentivize technological advances? How do we create a structure that supports more clean energy? Right? All of those things are going to be part of that future. So the future isn't just what do we regulate, it's also how do we regulate and what's the right balance between the regulation and the market.
So as you're writing your book, as this comes out, what are some of the biggest misconceptions that you hope to address? Because I think there are going to be big differences in how people have seen capitalism and how people have view it based on a couple different things. I can see generational changes are going to influence that a lot. I can't remember if it was at the start of this conversation or off the air, but younger generations are getting more and more disillusioned with large corporations, with kind of capitalism as a whole. There's a big push to shop local and to support people where you can see a bigger impact in your environment. There's probably also a big political implication with this, but for people who maybe don't have it on their radar that capitalism is this thing that has this negative downside to it, what are the biggest misconceptions you hope to address about sustainable capitalism?
So I think just the very notion, when I say those two words together, people they give me the head tilt. Like, is that even the thing? Can you even do that? So that's really the number one, right? I think we can be much more sustainable within a capitalist framework. So that's probably the number one thing I want people to take away. Probably this issue about markets and regulation is the number two thing. Is I want people to understand we are always regulating markets. Always, 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 always. There's no such thing as a free market. And so your economist friends, I bet they would have less to argue with me about than they think that they would, because they would say, well, we should do X. And I say, maybe, what's the outcome that you want to have? Okay, well, let's think about what that outcome might be. And they're going to know more than I do, frankly, because I'm not an economist, about what the best way is to get there, right? And so that's the number two thing, is we're always using regulation. We are always creating structures to balance the market and the regulation. And it's doing so thoughtfully with an idea in advance of what the outcome is that we want. And then recalibrating and saying, is this getting us what we want? Because I don't know. This doesn't look like what I wanted, or maybe this is exactly what I wanted, right? And then I think the other couple of things I want people to think about is, when you say that you don't like capitalism, or you think capitalism is evil, or you think capitalism is doing these terrible things, I want you to think about, what do you think that word means? Because I think that is at the heart of a lot of these conversations. So for many students, when they say capitalism is evil, what they think that word means is businesses are required either legally or ethically to maximize profits at all costs. That is not true. It's not true from a legal perspective. And depending on your ethics, right? People are different. It is not necessarily an ethical requirement. So if I can get students to take that away and say, oh, I'm not required to maximize profits. What could I do with business if I didn't have to maximize profits? What could business look like if it operated as a force for good in society? So those misconceptions I really want people to think about. And then I do want people to think about, and I particularly want our younger generation to think about, what are the other social things that are going on that we may be attributing to capitalism, but like may have a different source. You know, I hear and I read like loneliness is because of capitalism, beauty standards are because of capitalism, isolation is because of capitalism, people not getting married is because of capitalism. Like, when you start delving into it, you can find just about anything laid at the feet of capitalism. And I guess I would sort of challenge people to say, like, what is it that you think capitalism is doing that is destroying relationships? And maybe just to challenge it a little bit, but also act, what is making people so lonely? Why are people feeling isolated? Why are people not in relationships, right? And what can we do about those things? Because I think that connection and belonging is sort of the work of the day, is figuring out how we create more connection and belonging in society. And let's not just write it off. Let's not just assume that we have no power or control there. We do. We have a lot of power and control.
I think that's really good. My motto, I don't know if that's the right thing, but my motto for my students is I want you to get high-paying, meaningful jobs. Meaningfulness is really big. So I think those challenges that you talked about lastly, loneliness, why aren't people getting married? Why aren't people having families? Are, big issues that are going to be coming up because, there are big issues to talk about dealing with the world, with the environment, with everything else. But what happens if the people who live in those societies and environment, are struggling? What's the point of, all this stuff that we're doing if people are struggling and depressed and not thriving, if they're just barely surviving? So
right.
I think that's another thing that, personally interests me, because organizational behavior, that's all about thoughts and feelings and emotions and relationships between people. So that's something I'm really interested in.
Yeah. I do think, I said, and I can't remember if I said this before when on air or not, but I always try to look at when somebody is opposed, their beliefs are really opposed to mine. Like, well, what do they think that belief is going to do for their family and the people that they love? And it's really easy for me to look at somebody somewhere making a choice, like dumping a chemical into a water supply or cutting down a big, beautiful tree, right? And, those things break my heart. And that person is providing for their family. And that person is trying to create a structure that there's going to be support for their family, maybe for generations. And so then I got to ask myself, okay, right? Like, would I make a different choice if I was in that structure? And what can I do to support those outcomes that they want, support them as people, support their families, support the people that they love? What does that look like? How do I think about that? That's going to get us a lot closer, I think, than just coming up with a series of rules or, my 10-point policy, perspective. That policy perspective is never going to work if we don't ask, how are people trying to meet the needs of themselves and their families?
And I think ultimately most decisions that people make in life come back down to that decision, whether on a personal level, for the familial level, or even if you think that's what's going to make, the best choice for the country or for the world as a whole. I think ultimately that's what a lot of people's motivations come back down to. So that's something really interesting, I think, that, that we've talked about, something that is going to be touched on in this book. But I know I've had you on for a while, but one last question I have about the book. So there are 15 chapters. Are there any chapters that you were most excited about, or something that you really want to talk about?
Of course, my chapter. So the first chapter of the book, I would just, if you're interested in this idea, I would point you to that first chapter. So in the first chapter of the book, I just really lay out this idea of what is capitalism, and trying to dig into why do we feel bad about it, what good it can do, and setting up the challenge of trying to figure out. It's really hard to figure out how to make something sustainable if you don't even know what the thing is that you're talking about. So that's probably the first place that I would point people towards, is just take a look at that first chapter. And it's also, by the way, for free on SSRN. If you search for me in sustainable capitalism, you can find a draft of that chapter, and you can just read it there. The other couple of chapters that I find particularly interesting, and kind of the ideas that I find them all interesting. I love all my children, but there's one of the things I really wanted to have in the book was a chapter about racism, capitalism, and to think about some of the long-term impacts of regulation on Black and white Americans and non-white Americans. And so there's a chapter by Elizabeth Kennedy that looks at some of those issues and talks about how did the wealth gap get created between Black and white Americans, and how it was furthered by very specific legal structures and policies. So that's one I like to direct people towards. I think the labor chapter, there's a chapter by Elizabeth Brown on labor that I think is really important and interesting, because very small changes in the way that labor is provided a voice within corporate structures, I think could be really important. And then I think, just to kind of get people thinking, the chapter on environmental law, which is kind of towards the end of the book, doesn't take the usual sort of approach to environmental law and think about environmental law just as a series of big laws. A lot of people, we study environmental law, it's like, well, it's the Clean Air Act, it's the Clean Water Act. And instead, what the author does there, Christy Brecken, she talks about environmental law as an ecosystem, and kind of what that ecosystem approach to thinking about environmental law and regulation would look like. So it's really kind of this interesting big picture idea of what environmental law and regulation can look like. So those are probably three that particularly stand out to me. Like I said, I do love all my children. They're all wonderful. And I guess just one more, Dan Cahoy wrote a really interesting chapter on technology, and how we can think about technology and innovation in capitalism. And so if you are a positivist and you're looking for kind of some of the where's the positive stuff about how capitalism can be a catalyst for positive change, I think that chapter is really fun too.
Wonderful. Inara Scott, the editor of Sustainable Capitalism, Essential Work for the Anthropocene. Do you want to hold up your book so everyone can see it?
I will. There she is. Got my tabs in there as well,
and came out 2024. When was it actually released?
I think it was just actually sent out to mailboxes in October, maybe. So just been out a couple of months. Would love for people to pick it up. And please, we have a website with information about each one of the chapters. I think it's Sustainable Capitalism Book. And you can also just Google me and Sustainable Capitalism. And I love hearing from folks. So I'm really easy to get a hold of. You found me, right? So you're welcome to always reach out to me. And if there's any faculty out there who are interested in designing classes or interested in kind of thinking about activities, we're also working on adding to the website some sample activities for each chapter to help folks develop some curriculum about these ideas. So
wonderful. Before I let you go, I ask every person I interview the same question. You have attained a degree of professional success. You started off as a lawyer. You still are a lawyer, but you've moved more towards the academic side. So, you do have professional success, but what advice do you have for someone who's trying to be successful in life and in their career?
I just had this conversation with my daughter, who is a brilliant young person. She's in nursing school. She's about to graduate. And we were talking about the idea of balance. And I think, so we hear a lot about balance today. We hear a lot about self-care and, that sort of thing. I think it's really important to know not all periods of your life are going to be balanced in the same way. Like, balance doesn't have to mean 50-50. I love my job. I love the work that I do. And there are times in my life when that job consumes all of my free time. And that's okay. Right? Like, I think that there's partly sometimes people have this feeling like, oh, if I'm working too much, that's a bad thing. It's bad if it's undermining, right, your health, your mental health, your physical health, whatever. But you will have balance in different ways at different times of your life. If you have a baby, if you have a new family, if you get burnt out, there may be times when you have to pull away from that, and that's great too. Your balance may shift over time. So I would just encourage people to know that life is constantly changing, and that you are going to have different amounts of energy to pour into different parts of your life at different times in your life, and be open to that. And that's great.
I think that's awesome. That's something I've, had to adjust with. I have a young family. We just had a baby a couple months ago, baby number 2. So that's been a big shift. But, how do I balance my job? How do I balance podcast? How do I balance,
Sure.
everything else that I'm doing? I actually published a paper on work-family balance, and a lot of the literature talks about things that enrich your life, things that kind of deplete, and the differences that roles have. But the definition that I used is that people will have kind of a match in their values of work-life balance. So people will see that they're balanced based on how they view balance. It's not 50-50. Because
Right.
if you love your job, but
Yeah.
what if you could only work on your job 8 hours a day, and you're saying, I'm just getting started. I want to go home, I want to have dinner, and I want to go sit down on my computer and work.
That's right.
That's not going to be balanced. But if you're at a different point of your career, maybe if you have young children, maybe if you have grandchildren, maybe if you're sick of your job, maybe you need to take a sabbatical, maybe you need to take some time off, maybe you need to do X, Y, and Z. So when I view balance, it's how people define balance. So balance for you may be absolutely not what balance is for me. So I think that's a perfect definition of what balance is, because it's going to change.
It's going to change. Yep. And you just got to embrace it. I am a big believer in embracing change, and not particularly for young people. So if there's any, young folks out there, I think it is so overwhelming to try and think like, I have to figure out the career, right? Or I have to figure out the thing. And guess what? You're going to figure it out for 3 or 4 years, and then it's going to change. So don't go into it feeling like this is a decision you're making forever. This is a decision you're making for now. And yeah, it'll have long-term repercussions, but shoot, people have 5 or 6 careers in the course of a lifetime. Don't feel like just because you do one thing now, you have to do that for the rest of your life. Go out there, explore, do different things, be unbalanced for a while. It's all good. It's all going to help you grow.
I think that's great. I heard a story of, I might have saw it on Reddit or something, but because you're a lawyer, they said they went through their first, year as an associate lawyer, their first year, and they said they absolutely hated it. But kind of this sunk cost fallacy, they said, you know what, I already spent 3 years, I got the bar, worked my first year, 40 years later when they retired, they didn't like their career. So I think we're seeing this more and more. Newer generations are changing companies more often, they're changing their field. So I think you're spot on.
Sounds good. Well, I really appreciate you reaching out to me. I love talking about the book. So, and just the whole idea. So I appreciate it. And I wish you success with your podcast. It seems like a really great endeavor. And I wish you success with your new family, with your balance.
So do I. Thank you. So Inara Scott, editor of Sustainable Capitalism, Essential Work for the Anthropocene. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
And everyone, you have a great day and happy learning. We'll see you next time.